John, I'll mute you while Anthony is on.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's LGBTQ webinar series for the Northwest. So far we've talked about lived experience of LGBTQ colleagues and peers, and we've talked about transformation, talent management and development, and we've talked about health and wellbeing. Today's presentation from John Restall, who I'm really pleased to say I've known for a really long time, probably nearly 20 years, John, and that's a bit scary, isn't it? John is the Chief Exec of Managers in Partnership, which is the managers branch of Unison. So he's going to tell us about some of the rationale from an employer's perspective and trade union perspective about equity in the workplace. So John, over to you.
John, just unmute your microphone, please.
Thousands of team calls later and I'm still making the same old mistake. So thank you very much for that introduction, Anthony, and thanks for Ivo for his help in getting me online over the last hour. What I wanted to do today was go through some of the rights-based side of the agenda. So obviously as a trade union we look pretty closely at what people's legal and other employment rights might be around issues of sexual orientation and other workplace issues, but also to sort of broaden it out a little bit, because in some ways if you need to use your rights, then you're probably working in an environment that is suboptimal, that is dysfunctional, and actually the bigger agenda here is to create positive workplaces that have people's well-being and personal characteristics at its heart, rather than as something that needs to be challenged and defended. So throughout the presentation I will focus on the rights, but I think there are some bigger issues around how we manage diversity in the workplace and how trade unions can help employers and other staff to improve the experience of everybody in the workplace. So if I could just go to the first slide, please. I'll say a little bit about Managers in Partnership, which is why I know Anthony so well, because he's been a very active member of the union for several years. And MIP, for those of you who don't know, is a trade union for the health and care management community throughout the UK. So we have members working in all parts of health and care, including NHS England improvements, trusts, CCGs, CSUs, and over the borders we have healthy memberships in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Is there a problem with the slides, or are people seeing a slide? Because I'm not picking that. There we go. We have 6,000 members and nearly 100 workplace reps. So these are managers who are members of MIP who undertake duties representing, advising, supporting members in the workplace and working with employers. We're not exclusively in the public sector, so we have members in the private sector, voluntary and third sector, and as I mentioned earlier, in social care as well. One of our sort of five missions as a trade union is to advance the cause of equality in the workplace, and clearly today I want to talk about LGBT plus equality and trans equality as well, and we do this in a number of ways. We obviously support individual members, but we have campaigning objectives as well, both nationally and in the workplace, which we pursue as our own union, with other trade unions in healthcare, and obviously with the broader trade union movement as well. I think one of the interesting things about MIP is the fact that all of the members and all of the activists are also managers as well. So when we talk about workplace issues, we often come at it from two angles. One, the angle of the employee, but the other, the angle of the manager, and more often than not, the viewpoint of the line manager, so the person who has direct responsibility for individual members of staff. If we could move on to the next slide. So LGBT plus equality is clearly still an issue in the workplace. We've had massive improvements in awareness and experience and attitudes over 20 years. I'm sure everyone's been watching It's a Sin, and the attitudes of the 1980s, which I remember really well as a young teenager, were pretty in pretty stark contrast to the way young people talk about LGBT plus now and their experience of the issue. But there's still fair to say we're very far from a position of full a true equality. So some recent research, just to make it clear this is a live issue. 2016 trans people were found to face discrimination in recruitment and promotion, with many working below the level of their education and qualifications. And up to 50% of respondents in that particular bit of research said they'd experienced harassment and bullying at work. So for trans people, very much still a negative experience more often than not. In 2017, the TUC, a trade union congress, for those who don't know, found that lesbian, gay and bisexual workers were more than twice as likely to be bullied and discriminated against than heterosexual workers. And that has its echo in NHS staff surveys over the recent period as well. And finally, and more topically, in 2019, the TUC found that sexual harassment of LGBT plus people at work was more prominent than people thought, with 68% of the respondents saying they had experienced at least one form of sexual harassment at work. So despite massive and very welcome and heartwarming progress, there remains for many LGBT plus and trans people a negative experience in the workplace, which has huge implications, of course, for their whole lives. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of rights, these are very text heavy slides, and the idea is that we'll circulate them afterwards. So they've been sort of produced rather as a resource for you to have afterwards than necessarily to be read through. But in these slides, I'm sort of indicating where the key legal rights to not to be discriminated against the grounds on sexual orientation come from. And as with all protected characteristics, it's the Equality Act 2010 which gives rise to those rights. And it's an act that covers all sizes and types of employer and all types of worker. So it's not simply permanent staff, it will be agency, temporary and other staff. And it bans both direct, which is often the very visible form of discrimination, and also indirect discrimination. And it expressly outlaws harassment on the grounds of someone's sexual orientation, irrespective of whether their behaviour was intended to cause a harm or offence to the individual or not. So unintentional offensive behaviour is covered by the Act in the same way as something that was more intentional and perhaps overtly bigoted or prejudiced. And it protects all people, whatever their sexual orientation. So it's not simply cases of LGBT plus workers. You could have a straight person who similarly is subjected to homophobic harassment for some reason, and they would also be protected by the Equality Act. Workers are also protected from discrimination by association. So somebody who might be getting abuse because of the orientation of a family member, for example, which does happen quite a lot in the workplace, that would also be covered by the Equalities Act. And of course, civil partnership and same-sex marriage laws mean that the same-sex spouses or civil partners must be treated the same as a mixed-sex spouse in terms of workplace benefits. So when I started in trade unions, we had a whole range of survivor dependence benefits, pensions and others that were wholly dependent on someone's married status at the time. So someone in a long-term partnership or relationship, certainly a same-sex one, would not have had the access to those benefits certificates in the same way as straight colleagues. So that's a quick canter through rights at work, and obviously they are the basis on which we as a trade union might challenge bad practice, poor behaviour in the workplace. If we move to the next slide, which looks at probably a topic you've covered well already, is to look at how people can be a good LGBT plus ally in the workplace. And you know, a key thing, and this is true of all protected characteristics, is people, particularly in the dominant group in any workplace, speaking up for other people in that workplace. So speaking up for LGBT plus people, for equality, and actually challenging homophobia, biphobia when they see it, and not expecting to leave it to LGBT plus people themselves to defend their own equality. It's the most important thing I think anyone can do, is just stand up for what you think is right, and that includes for other people, and to do so when there are no other LGBT plus people present, if that's required. So accept it is wrong in whatever circumstances and challenge it, and do this in meetings as well as one-to-one interactions. So I think it is, and it can have huge impact, this. In some ways it sounds like people have to be incredibly brave, but you don't have to. You can be very measured and calm, and it does have an impact on attitudes within a group. Of course, don't assume that everyone knows who everyone is in terms of their sexual orientation, or that people know who would want to be protected in this way. And obviously, homophobia and biphobia are not the subject of jokes in the way that I think very often they are in the workplace. And humour, which is probably something that is quite a difficult one, as someone who likes a joke myself, humour can be one of the more difficult areas for people to navigate when they're thinking about homophobia and biphobia. So what sounds like funny to most and might be funny in certain contexts could be deeply offensive and excluding in another context. And I think people need to think very carefully about how they use humour, particularly around colleagues they might not know that well. Ivo, if we can have the next slide. Clearly really topical for us at the moment is trans workers. So not going to sort of get into the very wide political debate that's going on around trans rights, but just to sort of set down here in this slide a brief explanation of what the rights currently are. So the Gender Recognition Act enables anyone over the age of 18 to have full legal recognition of their gender in which they live, and that employment rights do not depend on that person having a certificate. So an employer really needs to just simply consider what the individual employee it chooses to identify as. And again, the Equalities Act protects against certain forms of discrimination because of gender reassignment in both employment and services. And again, like the Equality Act for LGBT plus staff, it applies to all types of employer and types of employee. And again, it bans the direct and indirect discrimination and victimisation. So the Act is really clear that it is not necessary for people who have had a medical diagnosis or treatment in order to gain protection. It's a personal process, and it's that self-identified gender that gives rise to your rights under the Equalities Act. And similarly, people can be discriminated against because they were wrongly perceived to be trans, and they can and by association with family members and so on. So the same sorts of protections as we saw in the LGBT plus slide apply to trans workers. And in terms of allyship, the next slide. Similar theme again. So speak up whether or not trans people are present. Don't leave it to them to speak up for themselves. And do so in all sorts of interactions. And in spades, the issue of jokes and humour is absolutely the same for this group of colleagues as it is for other protected characteristic groups. So that is a sort of canter through the rights and the allyship dimensions, and a lot of our reps will be trained in how to both identify where rights have been breached, but also on how to support colleagues in the workplace through, being a good ally. If I can move to the next slide. So I mentioned at the beginning that we as a trade union are a trade union of managers, and for us, obviously, the support for people who you might be line managing is absolutely critical. It can be perhaps the #1 factor that determines the experience of a lot of employees at work, and we kind of know that from the sort of common wisdom sayings like, you don't leave a job, you leave a boss, and so on. We know that line managers are really important for people's experience at work. So I'm not going to go through each of these tips, but being aware of the language to use, being prepared, I think, to make mistakes but acknowledge them and move on. As often as we found with race recently, it's sometimes better to try and have the conversation, even if it's clumsily done, than avoid the conversation altogether. So, most people who are in a minority group would rather they were spoken to about their issues, even if it's in a clumsy way, than those issues are just ignored and never acknowledged. So I think there is a lot to be done around the line management training offer and what line managers can do to really shape the experience of colleagues who are going through, maybe coming out as trans in the workplace. So I wanted to talk now a bit more about that broader agenda, and my own view, and I think it's shared by quite a few people, is that we have tended to over-rely on individuals using their legal rights to challenge the predominant culture or management behaviour in a workplace. And that in itself is a hugely stressful thing to ask individuals to do. It's often wholly unrealistic to expect a few people to take on the powerful forces within their workplace. And really what most of our members would want is, rather than the ability to challenge poor behaviour, is never to experience the poor behaviour in the first place, that actually it's a open, supportive working culture that we should all be working for. So if I can move to the next slide, Ivo, some sort of more broader campaigning points about why fairness in the workplace matters. And I think the first point for me is because it just does. If you've accepted the validity of people's lifestyles, the characteristics that they have, then it doesn't really matter whether there's a business case attached to treating them well or not. You should just be treating people well because it's the right thing to do. And I've sat through, endless strategic advisory groups on all sorts of equalities issues where we we focus on what's the business case for treating people well, rather than perhaps just starting with the obvious one, which is it is just the right thing to do. And if you are in an ethical, values driven organisation, then fairness matters in its own right, rather than just simply as a means to an end. So not a point to get lost, but I wanted to start with that. I think for a lot of people, particularly young people or more junior colleagues, the visibility of a group within the workplace really matters. So it's really important to people to see leaders who are openly LGBT+ and don't suffer discrimination as a result of that, and have successful careers. It is important for senior management in particular to be representative, not just of the workforce, but of the wider community. And that really has a major impact because it helps determine how services are delivered and how policies are created. The experience of people, the information and knowledge that they have helps to inform better and safer service delivery. And I think we've seen examples of that recently, where the absence of that input has created wrong policy decisions or poorly communicated ones, and it's actually meant that the business of the organisation has suffered. And obviously in our business that is healthcare and health protection. But the one I wanted to focus on, because I think it's the one that we can all grapple with easiest, is the fact that people perform at their best when they are working in a fair environment that respects and values them. And most organisations, I think, are only dimly aware that that is the reality of the performance of the people in their organisations. So Big Four consultancies have started to do research on the organisations that are best at managing diversity are also the ones that are more likely to be successful and most profitable. So there is a sort of core understanding that fairness is not simply a nice to have or a moral duty. It actually creates the environment where people perform at their best. If I could have the next slide. So before going into a bit more as to why that might be, I just wanted to have an interactive moment with you, the audience. I don't actually know from my screen how many people are out there, but just a question, maybe a sort of 90-second kind of reflection. When you personally are working at your best, when you're in the flow, when you're smashing it in your job, what does it feel like and what's going on and why is it happening? Why are you succeeding in that way? So just spend, say, 60 seconds thinking about that moment. We've all had it, even if we like to pretend we don't have it routinely. Just think what it was like when you were working at your absolute best. And then in a minute's time, you can start pushing those into the chat function. And I believe, Anthony, you're going to do a little roundup of whatever.
I'm going to do a little roundup. We've
That's
got
lovely.
12 people in the chat so far.
Great.
I'll come off mute. So we've got a few bits of feedback happening here. So we've got people saying it's when you feel engaged, when you feel valued, when you feel ownership of what it is you're doing, and when you feel you can make a positive contribution.
Brilliant. Anything from your own experience, Anthony?
Pretty much all of those things, I'd say. I mean, probably. I think it is a bit about. I think it's about feel that you make a positive contribution, feeling that you're heard, listened, and valued, but also that actually what you're doing has an impact on patients. I think sometimes it's about drawing that line between what we all do and the impact and consequence of improvement that we're trying to make.
Yeah. And it sort of sets you up for the next challenge, doesn't it? It means you're going to go into the next challenge with a lot of confidence. I mean, that for me is why I love doing successful work, because I can think of the next thing I'm going to attempt and achieve.
So we've got rewarding, we've got team support, we've got senior acknowledgement and feedback. We've got it feels positive, happy, have the feeling I can achieve anything. It needs to be in a supportive environment. Feel the opportunity to contribute. So really these are really quite powerful things, but these are all kind of quite some of these things are quite emotive, aren't they? Some of these things are about our kind of personal reassurance, confidence. And
they've got nothing to do with those sort of harder edge recognitions like appraisals or pay or promotion. They are, as you say, like quite personal, emotional benefits that you experience when you've done good work. So that plays nicely into my sort of next slide, because what I want to talk about is just a simple sort of model about why well-being is actually at the heart of so much of the organisational performance that is delivered. And it's a sort of insight that I think has only really started to become centre stage in the pandemic, actually, via the insight on well-being. And that's to say that we all come to work and we experience sort of degrees of stimulus that are either healthy or unhealthy. If you are in a job where you're under pressure, but you feel in control of your response to that pressure, then it's normally a really healthy stimulus. You know, you can go to work, you've got a challenge, you overcome that challenge, you feel great about it. At no point do you think it's beyond you or it's going to threaten you. And most employers should want to keep their staff in a position where they're under pressure and they cope with it well because they feel under control and in control and focused on the work. Put another way, none of us want to work in a job where there's absolutely no pressure, where there's no demand to do anything, there's no, there's no challenges. We probably, most of us, be quite bored and in our own way start to suffer from that. However, as you start to experience more stimulus, more pressure, more demands, and you feel less able to deal with them, you start to move into another space, which is you start to feel tension. And most of us, when we experience tension at work, we want to get rid of it. So we'll work hard to get rid of feelings of tension. But for most of us, we are still, even in tension, probably still quite engaged with our work. So, responding well to pressure, getting rid of tension is still signs of an engaged workforce. But you're starting to find that people are not perhaps coping as well. The bottom two is really where we need to be worried, and that is where tension is harder to deal with. You can't get rid of it. You start to experience strain. And eventually, if the strain becomes too much, the pressures become too hard, you can't overcome them, you can't deal with them, you experience stress. And stress for most people is a physical illness and flight and fright response that leads them to leave the workplace temporarily or permanently. Most of our occupational health service is worried about the people in the stress category, i.e. people who are already off work, and how do we get them back to work. People in strain are the ones that we should really be worried about, because in a sense they're the ones we should be intervening with. And in terms of performance, all of the evidence is there are more people who are present but suffering from some form of psychological distress than there are away from work because they have got a stress-related illness. So presenteeism is, in organisational terms, a much bigger problem than people who are away from the workplace and absentees. And there is a correlation between fairness, discrimination, bullying, harassment, and whether you're more likely to be experiencing pressure in a healthy way or in a negative way. So the more you distract people from their jobs with avoidable behaviours around discrimination, unfairness, bullying, unreasonable demands, inflexibility, the more likely you are to be pushing those people into less productive states of tension, strain, and sadly stress as well. So for me, COVID has proven that the well-being of individuals is really vital for the success of the NHS. And I think there's a big debate to come about how far we allow people to recover from what's happened before we place them in the next phase of pressure as we start the recovery from the pandemic, which obviously will start imminently. On the next slide, I think we therefore have just some pointers for what the sort of collective of both employers, managers and unions could be doing to manage the well-being of staff, keeping them in that happier state of manageable pressure and out of more negative states of strain and ultimately stress. And I think the first thing is to challenge everyone to actively manage diversity and go out and find ways of improving people's experience, rather than waiting for things to have gone wrong and then taking remedial action, or waiting for individuals for all the reasons I've said earlier, this is not a good mechanism for improvement, to rely on individuals to challenge poor behaviour, poor conduct through asserting their rights, taking legal processes and using policies. And I don't know if there is anyone from HR on the call, but if there are, be interesting to get your take on whether the policies and rights agenda has actually stopped us from making real improvements in the culture of the workplace, because we've over relied on it, and it clearly hasn't worked. If we were to go back to that slide, that's, you know, after nearly 20 years of rights, we still have really negative experience for a large chunk of the workforce. Again, as we've learned through the 1 million+ personal risk assessments, understanding the individual and their well-being and the other issues that might be in play for them. So, you know, you may be LGBT+, but you might also have other characteristics, issues in your life that make your life challenging, or on which you need support. This is really the new game, I think, after the pandemic, that we've got to get into the individual support, recognizing as well that individuals are all going to need different levels, types of support, one from the other, but never forgetting that everyone's well-being matters, no matter how different the support may need to be. And I think, I mean, Anthony's joined plenty of calls at our committee level. I would say every single discussion about what's going on now starts and ends with well-being. Both, you know, the prime importance of it, but also the huge challenge we have in a system that is perhaps not that well used to dealing with it or putting it at the heart of planning. You know, NHS England's letters to the service, which I read, you know, a good example where there's a recognition that wellbeing is important, but if you look at the actual underlying instruction or detail, it's often a lot skimpier than the other operational objectives that are being discussed. So I think we're at a phase where we understand its importance, but we're probably not yet ready to intervene to improve people's well-being in the workplace. Next slide, please, Ivo. So another question for you, and you know, thinking of the sort of 3 or 4 slides just gone, think about an example where you've seen really good management, either a line manager or a sort of senior management intervention or behaviour around an LGBT+ issue, where there's been a superlative culture or a really supportive culture that you've valued and enjoyed working in, or where colleagues were particularly supportive and were giving you know, good allyship to colleagues who were LGBT+ or to trans. And when you think about it, don't just sort of think of a general thing. Try and think about the actual specific things that those people did to make that a good experience in the workplace. And again, if like you did in the earlier question, if you could put your thoughts into the chat box, and our expert summariser, Anthony, will relay them back. So let's take a minute or so to do that as well.
John, just while people are doing that, there are some questions bubbling up in chat. Would you like me to give you one now to think about?
Let's do that, yeah. And shall I? Okay. I'll answer it at the end. There's not much longer to go on the presentation.
No, that's fine. So there's 3 questions so far. So yeah. I'll give them to you so you can be thinking about them. The first one is, are you able to summarise any themes from MIP members specifically on LGBT issues? So what are kind of the main themes that are bubbling up that MIP needs to work on? Yeah. For members. The second thing is, how at the moment with ICS development do we try and keep this conversation live around all protected characteristics, but in this space particularly LGBTQ? Yeah. And the third thing is, there's loads of conversation at management levels around burnout in staff. How can we work together, so organisation members and trade unions, around identifying burnout early? Yeah. And supporting the mitigation of it.
Okay, great questions.
So we've got a bit of feedback on your question. So a member of our executive team shared her LGB plus story trust-wide via email, encouraged staff to bring their whole selves to work. Another comment, being asked questions about me respectfully. Staff actively getting involved in Trust Pride event. All supportive, positive and happy to give up their time on a voluntary basis. So this is about, so I think what we're hearing really, the themes we're hearing are about us actually walking the talk, aren't they? Yeah. So we can make organisational commitments. What we need is actual proactive, pragmatic demonstration of that commitment.
Yeah.
Positive role models, positive images. We're seeing in here. What else? Well, I think we've covered the rest so far. Talent and development opportunities, broader opportunities than just for BAME staff. So I think it's fair to say we have focused on BAME and BME for obvious reasons, and that's not incorrect, but we just need to make sure we pick up on other protected characteristics so we're not disenfranchising any groups unintentionally.
Yeah.
And I think as work appears that's more, that recognises intersectionality, that will perhaps become a bit more obvious as we move forward.
Agreed.
Senior director level involvement in local LGBTQ plus events. Honest conversations in shared space. So that comes back to, so many gay people will say, will be challenged by the kind of multiple coming out that you have to do in work. So as you change roles or work with new people, you're constantly outing yourself.
All over again.
Every time. And honest conversations about how you spend your weekend and who you spend your weekend with, for example.
Any more?
I often say when I have these conversations with people that actually, as a gay man, the least interesting thing about me is who I sleep with. And I think that's actually a really interesting point to make, because
no offense to your partner, obviously.
No offense to my partner at all. No, he's used to me saying it. But it's, we're more about how we, it's quite lazy, isn't it, to not get to know someone as we would anybody else within our work group or our team.
Yeah.
And as long as those questions are asked respectfully, then oftentimes the answers are respectful.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, well, and changes to systems, final comment, changes to systems to include data currently missing from ESR. So we don't currently record on ESR trans, non-binary, gender diverse information, and that doesn't make people feel that they belong in this organisation.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I think you could create quite a nice guideline based on those contributions, and I think they are, clearly a wide range of behaviours from top leaders, which are obviously always important in the way that the culture of an organisation is set, through to what individual colleagues in your team might say, or how they might talk to you about your experience. So Stonewall has produced a fairly crunchy guide to line managers. I think that's the next and final slide, Ivo. So we should have worked out something where I'm doing this or something together. And again, I won't go through those, but in lots and lots of detail. But I think a lot of what we've just said from our own good experiences will be reflected in the Stonewall guidelines. So I've got these slides in with Ivo. I think you're going to circulate them to participants or make them available as part of the publication package.
We will do, yeah.
Go through them in a bit more detail, but I do think
I've got another question bubbling up if you're up for it. You want it now? So just on the back of this slide that you just put up, so someone's put in chat, are we moving towards the manager's competency framework? If so, how would we measure it, and what would the consequences be?
Yeah. Okay. I've got 4 questions there. So, and I've you know, I've kind of finished my presentation. There's one final slide with some contact info on. Perhaps we could put that up just to end. And my colleague Mercedes, who's our policy officer, really is a great sort of point of contact if you want to learn a bit more about what we're doing on LGBT plus issues. If you want to get involved, if you're an MIP member, then again, get through to her, and she can put you in touch with the right person inside our organisation. And I'm sort of happy to get into those 4 questions. How are we doing for time?
No, we're good for time. You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So please feel free to answer questions. I would just say, as a long-standing MIP member, I would absolutely commend people joining a trade union, in particular MIP. I think that we absolutely ask ourselves the right questions and focus our attention on the things that really matter for our members, and that's absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Couldn't have said it better myself. On the 4 questions, so sort of summarise, you know, the experience of MIP members. So I think there's a sort of experience for a lot of LGBT plus members of the visibility of sexual orientation in the workplace and the services they manage. So I think, you know, we talked a bit about the survey just there about can it be improved for trans. Well, actually, it's still not great data when we're trying to understand, you know, the sexual orientation of our workforce and what implications that might have for us as an employer. So I think there is still a lot of work to be done in collecting good quality data on, you know, the sexual orientation of the NHS workforce, and I think that comes out a lot in what our members say, because obviously it also affects the ability of the organisation to get resources put in the right place, the kinds of programmes that are available to perhaps more visible characteristic groups may not be as forthcoming because there's less understanding of just how many LGBT plus people there are in the workplace or what their issues and concerns might be. So visibility of both you know, characteristics, but also the specific issues and concerns that people have, I think is a major issue for MIP members. I think more problematically, I think is, and this one of the reasons why I think the rights agenda is quite a difficult one to pursue, and by rights agenda I mean the legal routes to challenging poor behaviour, is very often the burden of proof is too high for most situations, and it's therefore almost impossible to challenge certain forms of discrimination, and yet everyone knows it's present. So I think for a lot of LGBT plus members, it's a sense that there is low level, subtle, out of sight forms of discrimination that they're experiencing, but there's not a lot that can be done because no one's putting it in an email or saying it out loud in a meeting, and therefore the evidence base for that challenge doesn't exist. So I think in terms of individual behaviours and cases and problems, I think that is the number one. And again, it's why people are more interested in changing the whole culture rather than the mechanism for challenging, you know, poor behaviour within it. And I would say that is, if we could change one thing, that would be the one that most of our members would want us to do. I don't know if, I mean, Anthony, we've discussed this many times in various parts of the NG. How would you characterise the experience of our senior members now, so senior managers?
So I think things are massively progressing in some areas. I think there are still pockets of organisations where this isn't given the credence that it needs and deserves, and I also think that there has to be a confidence in the workforce to be able to raise and report these issues. And if at the first contact that you make with your line manager you're not supported to talk about the subject, then you walk away and either just accept it or you leave the organisation. So that first interaction, when you might be reporting whatever behaviour it is that you've seen, heard or felt, is really important.
Yeah.
Building that then confidence of an onward process.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think I'll take that fourth question about the competency framework, because I think that's at the heart of all of this, is that sort of the line manager and the managerial response to problems is absolutely critical. We've got sort of trailed within the white paper as some work on possible regulation of managers in the future, and clearly there's no real appetite for doing anything like a GMC for management right now, but there is a lot of interest in creating more standardized behaviors and competences across the management community. And I think, you know, certainly MIP's view is that the greater professionalisation, standardisation of management behaviours, particularly line management, is the right way to go. Most of our members, I think, would support it. It has to be done well. There has to be good consultation on how those frameworks are put together. But I think they're potentially really powerful tools to support the development of line management, and also I think give more credibility and status to the role of line manager. We tend not to think of line managers when we think of all the big challenges facing the NHS right now, but yet they are key to the experience of staff, the safety of services, the delivery of planning, and so on. And I think, you know, there's a lot of people with responsibility for other people in the NHS. You know, say 300,000 people have some kind of supervisory responsibility. We really chronically underinvest in their work. You know, we don't put the effort into the training development, the standards, and so on. I think my fears around the competency framework are that they will tend to be developed for the very top of the office. So we might get some national frameworks around, you know, chief executives and finance directors or whatever it might be, and then the effort will stop. I think if this is going to work, then we've got to have really good frameworks for every level of management and leadership in the organisation. And then it forms part of how you recruit to jobs, how you manage people in those roles, how you hold them to account for what they do. And I think how people choose to manage diversity should be part of the appraisal of an individual line manager. It's not simply an organisational responsibility, it's a management responsibility. So put that in. And then the consequences of that, I mean, I'm not even talking about regulation now, but if you were to routinely be failing a key part of your competency framework for your job, then obviously that gives rise to a performance disciplinary conversation in due course. So you could see that as a sort of pattern. And of course, people get that all the time now, but the thing is they get it on operational targets, or they might get it on finances. Are we ready to put issues of well-being and diversity on the same footing as the operational and the financial and the service delivery? And I think, you know, that's a good question to ask at the moment, because I think although we are saying the right things, you know, it's not quite there. CQC ditto, you know, can you have a outstanding organisation whose staff survey is telling you that people feel discriminated within that organisation? It happens, you know, because the external, you know, achievements are such, you know, good care. But nonetheless, there is, you know, there's another story going on inside an organisation, and, you know, over time, I don't believe that organisations that are in some ways fundamentally unfair will consistently deliver high quality services, because eventually, you know, that those poor experiences will leak into the services that the public receive, and I think we've got to really get to grips with that. Interested in what people think of that, and how, you know, how hard people should be managed around issues of well-being and diversity. And I would say that the way even I've put that suggests that line managers themselves aren't people who need support, and whose diversity and well-being also needs to be managed carefully. You know, I think we have a tendency to say managers are invulnerable rubber who can just do anything endlessly, and they care for other staff. And we are a bit of a, like, you know, no airline asks you to fit someone else's mask before you fit your own, but I think we tend to ask that of our line managers in the NHS, and I think that's something that we need to address. And I think that goes to the burnout point as well. I think we need to be really careful about the interventions around burnout, because it's a bit like the old resilience debate of 5-10 years ago. You know, the pressures are always going to be on us. They're always going to be unmanageable. They're always going to be terrible. But if only we could make people a bit more resilient, then the problem would be solved. And I think the real issue is, yes, you can help people cope better, but at the end of the day, how much you ask of them, the workload that you put upon them, the resources you give them, the time you give them to do work, the way in which they are managed to deliver, all of those factors are ultimately the ones that are going to determine whether someone burns out or not whether you've given them faster access to occupational health services, or important though those things are, they aren't the determinant of well-being in the workplace. It's, you know, the big ticket decisions around how much pressure you're prepared to put people under, you know, in order to get things done. So I think, you know, definitely under recognition of this as an issue. I think we have, and managers can be responsible for this a bit as well, this sense of the manager as an invulnerable person who knows all the answers and cope with any pressure and can work an extra 30 hours a week to get the job done. Actually, you know, we need to be much more open about whether that is the right way of working. And, you know, if that competency framework was strong, it might say how you model your hours of work, your attitude to doing everything, how you manage your own well-being, how you seek support around it. That might be part of the framework, because we have no interest in managers who fall over. You know, that cannot be what we want, because they're so important for other staff. On the ICS issue, I mean, I think, you know, the ICS stuff is going to be important. I mean, it's going to be important for people of NHS England who may see their jobs on the move, their functions moving around the system. So, you know, all of the stresses and strains that we see around a reorganisation. The experience of most reorganisations, diversity is the least prioritised issue. So gains you may have had around a reorganisation, around groups in, you know, protected characteristics, often get lost, and people lose their jobs, and you end up at the end of it with a less diverse workforce, and you wonder how that happened. So I think we do need to sort of say to policymakers that they've got the diversity of the system after the changes should be in their mind now. I think longer term, the ICS potentially could be the most powerful engine for workforce planning across, you know, all of the sort of health and care system. And it's interesting to see where diversity sits in, say, the current people plans for an area. Some of them mention it and have even plans, particularly around talent management, but others don't mention it at all. And it's all about, you know, the workforce supply issues, bums on seats, that kind of thing. And I think the ICS for me is where we should be loading quite a lot of expectation that issues of well-being in the workforce, issues of EDI are going to be dealt with in a strategic way. So, you know, we have a supply problem. Are we reaching out to all the groups that we want, you know, to be the future workers of the NHS, rather than worry about diversity once you've done a big push on getting people through the door? Are we measuring people's experience in enough detail to be able to then intervene in problem areas or improve support for various groups? So I think the ICSs at the moment have that potential. Obviously, we've got a piece of legislation to come which might say a little bit more about workforce elements of it. But I would say, from my experience of working alongside some of those managers, is they generally have a day job, and there are very few people at ICS level who are, you know, just dedicated to the ICS of remit, whether it's on workforce or anything else. So I think it's a good call, whoever raised it. I think it's absolutely going to be at the heart of things going forward. But I am concerned that EDI doesn't get its sort of place in the sun early enough in the planning process. And, you know, the thing to watch actually is any requirements made of an ICS on workforce. You know, where is equality, diversity, well-being, the experience of staff in the strategy? And if it's not there, then I think the work should be called in, and, you know, people should be challenged on that, if we mean what we're saying currently about well-being. So I hope that is those are answers really to the 4 questions.
No, that's really, really good. Just to go back to the answer about kind of line managers, and I think linking it with the burnout question, line managers are the most important people in assessing whether they think any members of their staff are exhibiting the factors that lead to burnout. And we don't measure burnout as such. What we measure are anxiety, stress, and those sorts of physical and mental reactions to feeling overloaded. And actually the one person that holds the ring on that is the line manager.
I agree.
So there is definitely a synergy between those two things, and I'm not sure that we always hold managers to account where staff are saying, I've got to go off long-term sick, I can't cope. I don't know whether we ever join that loop back up. I haven't seen that done particularly well, I have to say.
And I think it starts at the very top. So I've had about 3 conversations with trust chief execs in the last month, all around the fact they feel ready to fall over. And not one of them feels able to ring their regional director and say, this is how I'm feeling. Not one of them, because they think the culture of management, and this isn't just to talk about NHS England regional directors, is you don't fall over. Your job is to stay, like one of those weebles, for those of you old enough to know, you're always back on your feet. And I think that really, if that's the experience of chief execs, I think that cascades all the way down to the line managers that you're talking about. Is it's almost this admission of weakness or failure that you're feeling that way, and that's almost where we're starting from at the moment. So I think you're right, line managers almost have to break through people's sort of self-editing to make sure they really understand trying to get to the point where they really understand how someone is working. And this could be a bigger issue with home working, where in a sense your staff are even further out of sight than they have been to the past. How would you know how someone was faring, if really you've got a team call with them once every couple of days or something.
Totally. And this brings us back to conversations we've had in NHS E&I about how we engage with staff through their individual risk assessments, because would you disclose a vulnerable situation to a manager virtually, or a manager you may never have seen face to face? No, most people wouldn't, and yet we have that expectation. So we do need to put some narrative around that to provide some assurance, so we get the best outcomes to actually do good work with. The intent is good, but we have to look at it through the lens of people working alone in a place that might not necessarily be safe.
So I think it's interesting how we have overlaid fairness, equality and well-being, and it's almost woven into the same conversation throughout this, and I think that's absolutely key.
John, thank you so much.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Good to talk with you as always. Thank you so much for your slides. We do need to finish there, but we will circulate John's presentation if anybody wants it. We have recorded this session and we will post it on the EDI outward facing website. Thank you all for joining, and
thank you.
I look forward to speaking to you next week.
Okay, take care.
Thanks, John.
Have a good weekend.